Thanks. Look, I think that the discussion about Australian values is really misinformed. I don't know what Australian values are. My grandparents were all born here. Most of my great-grandparents were born here. And I, quite frankly, am ashamed of many of the things that Australia has done and is continuing to do. We've still got people exiled on Manus Island and Nauru. We're still treating asylum seekers like rubbish. You know, we've still got a terrible reputation around the world about these questions. What's been created over the last few years is this myth.
Is there a question for the panel, please?
Is a myth called Australian values. And we should not, any one of us, or anyone who lives in Australia, try to measure ourselves against that myth. We are critical of Australia. Sometimes we like some things about Australia. And I do have a question though, but it's for Dr. Kelly, which is, you mentioned 2001 and the confluence of 9/11 and the Tampa incident and the way in which Howard exploited both of those for electoral advantage, and probably 3 federal elections now on the refugee issue. It's been a major issue. Do you, in retrospect, think that the Labor leader at the time, Kim Beazley, should not have stood with John Howard in supporting the measures that he took, and that Labor, since then, should not have taken that direction?
Thanks for the question, because it really does strike to the heart of that issue of values, and I have to tell you, I've been deeply uncomfortable with Australian politics, in fact ashamed of Australian politics for a good couple of decades now, on all sides of politics, and in terms of the general community attitudes that have kind of supported that in many ways, noting that they've been exploited by misinformation as part of that. But I was in the Defence Force during the Children Overboard saga, and during the Tampa business I was serving in East Timor with the United Nations headquarters, working with UNHCR and Norwegian colleagues who were just looking at me going, what the hell's going on here? You know, this is not what we expect from Australia. And so I got this very intense personal experience of seeing it from foreign perspectives, and for the first time ever being kind of ashamed of being Australian. And that hasn't improved much over the years until very recently, when Labor's policy that was produced for the 2015 National Conference, for the first time I was actually comfortable with our politics. It's a good set of measures that have been adopted there. So I think that will be good if we can be elected and go forward with that, but there's still a remaining question of Manus and Nauru. And I had the opportunity to actually speak with one of the inmates up there via an iPhone conversation, and it really is terrible. But that is the situation now. We must finally resolve the situation of those poor people on Manus and Nauru, continue with the US process, accept the New Zealand offer, and just clean out those facilities as quickly as possible to do something to remediate the national disgrace that has been that situation.
It's completely inhuman.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kelly. Can I also add one thought, that if you don't like one of the policies of whichever government it is, at the moment it's the coalition government, don't hesitate to write to the ministers personal letters expressing your views on what you think should happen, whether it's an instance of Islamophobia or where it's discrimination. And I agree with what you said about that broad term Australian values, because our panel has referred to the values of a common humanity. And I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. Also, when we're talking about the clothing, the Australia I grew up in, I'll come to a question in a moment, the Australia I grew up in was, the streets were, one could see nuns with full habits and clothing, Catholic, Anglican. It wasn't an unusual sight to see women clothed with head coverings, but we don't see it anymore because the degree of religious observance and adherence in many faces no longer what it was. And part of it is that Australians are no longer used to it. But there are many other aspects in that. You know, there's an aspect of mob rule. When in discussion with my colleagues, I mentioned that when Jacques Chirac, the French president, was conducting nuclear tests in the Pacific, I was living in Sydney then, And any restaurant or cafe or patisserie with a French name, even though they were owned by Australian citizens who may have been of Belgian, Swiss or French origin, they had their windows smashed. It's mob rule, it's a mob mentality. It's a kind of thing which is sad, but we see evidence of it, and with the latest target group, which is the Muslim migrants and the Muslim residents of Australia. They're the most recent, but there have also been others targeted as well. You might recall the members of the Indian community, young people in Melbourne who've been murdered. So, you know, these are the kinds of things we all have to oppose. We all have to stand up for human rights in this area. Sorry.